So I'm delighted to be here, if also a little bit intimidated to be here, that when Kim invited me to participate in this course in the summer, my first response was, what's singularity? What does that even mean? So I had to do a little research on that, and then from there I thought, but nothing I do has anything to do with this. So I like to think of this as the lecture for you that is, and now for something completely different. And we'll see at the end whether you think that I've made any connections at all to the actual topic of the course. Just to give you a little bit of background for me, because I think that helps you to know where I'm coming from as I talk through this course, through this lecture. I'm a historian of 16th century science. So I look at the development of scientific principles and communities and philosophies from the late Middle Ages to the early modern period. And I actually specialize in the history of mathematics and geography, so not exactly history of medicine. And I realized that that was never even one of my comp fields. So all of my history of medicine comes from the side of science, which these days is not the way that history of medicine thinks of itself. That in an older time, history of medicine was part of history of science, but now it's much more of a social history of patients and behaviors and interactions among sick and well people. Whereas when it was part of history of science, it was about how ideas change through time. So the part that you'll see from me is more like how ideas change through time. Really what it will be looking at is how we put society into the picture when we think about changing scientific principles. So as I sat there thinking about what I wanted to say to you all, I realized, I started by saying, why have I even been asked to present in this course? And a possible answer is that I've been asked to present because people think that historians will tell you interesting things that have happened in the past, and they will show you predictions that now have come true, things they thought were magical that we now know are real, and so that this is a kind of, those people in the past were kind of naive, but now we know better, and wasn't that amazing that they got it as right as they did, even in moments when they had no resources. Well, you're not going to hear that from me, because that's not what I believe is the purpose of history. That the purpose of history is not to convince you that we are the smartest people that have ever lived on Earth. In fact, the point of history is exactly the opposite. The point of history is to tell you that people in the past thought completely well thought up, philosophically sophisticated systems of how nature and the world worked, that worked completely well within their context. And therefore, to be cautious when we think of our own world, that we know the truth. Because what we know is how we understand nature within our context. And it works extremely well for us. But with a different context, a different set of things that need explanations, a different understanding of what would constitute an explanation, we would have a very different understanding of nature, of sickness, of who we are as human beings. And so I think that the huge value of looking at, especially history of science and medicine in the past, is that it reminds us that we live in what Thomas Kuhn famously called a paradigm, and that when we step out of that paradigm, we could have a completely different way of understanding nature. And part of that is because nature, I want to argue, is what philosophers sometimes call underdetermined. That is, that nature does not sit there very clearly for us and tell us how we should explain it, what its answers are. That it gives us a range of data points, and we put those together in order to tell a story. That's especially true for illnesses, that especially in the past, but in the present as well. We see a number of symptoms, we put them together, we tell a story about what that is. We tell a story that makes sense to us because of the world that we live in. Let me tell you an example of that may help you to understand where I'm going with this. That in the past, we have had a series of people who have had ecstatic experiences, ecstatic religious experiences, where they have fallen on the floor, they have lost their sense of where they are for a time. Saint Teresa was a very good example of this. And when she revived, what she told was a story of Christ having come to her and ravaged her, in fact, that she felt the sword of Gabriel piercing her chest. And we might say, oh, well, let's look at those symptoms. Maybe, in fact, what she was is an epileptic. Maybe what she was is that she was bipolar, that we try and come up with our definitions of what happened. But she had an ecstatic experience. She had a relationship with God. And for us to belittle that by saying really it was just some physical symptom that we would now put together as a particular kind of illness is not to understand her experience of the world. And I think that that's a message that you all need as you think about what we think technology is doing for us. Because we experience that world because it's our world, and it might not be doing the things we think it's doing. So in a sense, this lecture is a cautionary tale that we don't want to be seduced by the wonder of technology because we need to understand that underlying technology is a philosophical, political, and economic world that creates it and sustains it. And if we don't understand what that philosophical, political, and economic world is, we use technology at our peril. So, let me see if I can make this work. So let me start with Arthur C. Clarke's third law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so what I want to do with that is to think about what is magic. So we go back to a time when magic was the technology rather than just a way of thinking about a different kind of mechanical technology. Today, when we talk about magic, we tend to think about magic as theater tricks, as David Copperfield producing an elephant in the middle of the stage. It's full of wonder, but with a rational explanation if only we knew it. In fact, it's very interesting. There's a whole host of magicians, starting with Houdini, who were themselves debunkers of spiritualism and magical ideas, right up to Randy the Magnificent, who now will pay you money if you can show him something that defies a rational explanation. Magicians in the 19th and 20th century and 21st century are actually rationalists. They have tricks that they delight in fooling us with. But that's not what magic meant in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. I mean, we will say that something works like magic. We don't really mean that there's some underlying force that we cannot understand that's making it happen. It just means it's invisible to us, that it's an advanced technology. But especially in parts of the world where Western science is well, not but, especially in parts of the Western world where science is seen as offering a full explanation for natural phenomena, magic is dead. There is no such thing as magic in most Western worlds now. But for many centuries, nature was wondrous. Nature was magical. It was inexplicable. It was hidden from our view and could not be revealed in many ways. There were parts of the world that we could not explain because of who we were, because of our relationship to God, because of how God had created nature. And so part of that is that, of course, God performs miracles. For many, many centuries, everyone would believe that God could and did perform miracles. But there were also secrets of nature which were natural and yet magical. And that if humans could know some of these secrets of nature enough, they could manipulate nature. They could make nature do what they wanted them to do. So in the Middle Ages, and when I say the Middle Ages, I'm being very vague here, but we think in the Middle Ages can be from about the 6th century to about the 15th century. I'm probably talking especially about what sometimes gets called the High Middle Ages, which is from the 12th century on. In the Middle Ages, most scholars, and in fact most regular people too, believed that God had given us two books. And I'm especially talking about Europe in this context, I should say. So God had given us two books. He had given us the book of the Bible, which is called revealed knowledge, and he had given us the book of nature, which was in a sense secret knowledge. That nature was where we found his wonders, that the world was wondrous. And the Bible could help us understand our spiritual journey, but nature was there to provide us with God's spiritual journey. It was to show us the power of God. And if you've watched what happens when hurricanes strike, you know that the power of God is awesome. And I use that term in its philosophical term. That is something that is full of awe. We tend to use awesome in far too easy a way now. Oh, awesome. But think of it as being awe-inspiring. That's what nature was. Now, one of the problems for human beings in this time when there were the two books of God is that we are all flawed people. That we had full knowledge in the Garden of Eden, but we had lost that. The fall from the Garden of Eden meant that we no longer had direct knowledge of how nature worked. And there's much conversation among scholars and theologians about just how far that fall is. That do we have access to God's knowledge if we work hard enough, or are we forever forbidden to see it? And those who saw signs of hope that we actually could understand how nature worked believed that this was because our link to God was through our reason. And so rationality was the way that we would find the secrets of nature. And so many, many scholars worked very hard to develop logical systems that would take you through how you'd reason out things, and then to use our reason to find what was going on under the surface. There are two different things that could be going on under the surface, because there's the natural world of wonders, and there's the supernatural world of wonders. So in the natural world, you have things that can cure you, things that can help you find things, things that give you power in various ways. Those are all natural. But supernaturally, there is a whole world that is written of in the Hebrew Bible, which tells us that there are angels and demons, there are supernatural beings. And so that can be a source of magic as well. And those were always very clearly differentiated in the Middle Ages. This was natural magic and supernatural magic. Supernatural magic meant that you were manipulating or communicating with spirits, or including those who had passed over. Again, the spiritualists of the 19th century were also trying to manipulate nature in that way. Whereas the natural magicians were simply trying to make nature help us to have power over crops, over weather, over difficult childbirth, all that kind of thing. It was always the case that supernatural magic was seen as very, very dangerous because you could not control those supernatural beings. And so probably throughout the Middle Ages and certainly well into the 17th or 18th century, that was seen as witchcraft. That was seen as something that could get you into very, very serious trouble if you were known to be communicating with supernatural beings. And if any of you have read Frankenstein, that is Professor Frankenstein's doom, is that he meddles with magic that he should not meddle with. It's a good book. If you haven't read it, it's not much like the movie at all. So most people who identified themselves, let's see if that's my next one. Most people who identified themselves as witches, and people did, and they were both male and female witches, though fewer male witches, they believed that they were practicing natural magic, or white magic as it was sometimes called. So white magic, natural magic, was largely medical in nature. It was based on herbal knowledge of what they called simples, that is, medicines that were created by different plants. and was based on astrological remedies, that is, the right time of the day, the right time of the year, making sure that the horoscope matched what you should be doing. So this was, in many ways in the Middle Ages, the predominant technology of medical treatment. That you had people in communities who knew how plants worked, who knew how the stars worked, and they treated people. They were often women. They were respected members of their community, and they got some help from scholarly treatises such as Albertus Magnus's Book of Secrets. This is probably the most famous book of this kind of natural magic, undoubtedly not written by Albertus Magnus, interestingly enough, but always seen as his book. It was a very popular book, and I suspect that it's never been out of print, as it were. I suspect that if you went to Amazon.com today, you would find the Book of Secrets available today. So that's a bestseller, that's for sure. It was very popular, and it was very popular because it was very instrumental. It really was a technology for curing, because what it told you was how to use particular natural objects to achieve ends that you desired. For example, if you think your husband's cheating on you, put this particular kind of rock under his bed and you will find out. Have you lost something? Take this other particular kind of rock and it will lead you to the thing that is lost. Are you worried that someone is on a great journey and they may not come back? Mix this particular potion and you will guarantee that they will come back to you. So these were, things that people worried about. They were things in nature that would allow you to do that. This was not about conjuring spirits. It was not even about your own spirituality. It was about, how do I take the secrets in nature and make them work for me? So it's about power over nature. It's an absolute technology. And as I said, it's very instrumental. Now, while the practitioners of this white magic could become scapegoats in times of crisis, most of the wise men and women were part of the community and provided very important services. The other part of what they did was to provide astrological help. That astrology was a very important part of this technology of understanding how the world worked, had been important from antiquity. So it's very interesting. My undergraduate students, when I teach, always get confused between astronomy and astrology, which is very telling in itself. So astronomy, study of stars and planets; astrology, study of how those stars and planets affect human lives. But the stuff you read in the paper, bad astrology. So do not ever mistake your horoscope in the paper for anything real. Prints the paper, something to put between the truckheads. So basically, the way that astrology works, it's important. I think the first thing to recognize is that it works particularly in a geocentric universe. And so that's why I put up that picture of a geocentric universe there. So this was the model of the universe from antiquity to the 16th century, and really through the 16th century. There are even ways today that we do things as if we lived in a geocentric universe. When we navigate on the oceans, it's as if this is the way things work. We even talk about the sun rising and setting, which is a geocentric model. So there's the Earth in the center, everything spins around it. Well, if that's your model, it makes sense, that, or at least it's plausible, that everything moving around the Earth is focusing in on the Earth, and therefore can be affecting the Earth and its inhabitants. And of course, it's really important that the Earth is in the center for two completely different reasons. One is an Aristotelian reason, that Aristotle saw that there were four substances: earth, water, air, and fire. And earth was the least subtle, the basest of all of the elements. And so it needed to be in the middle. So earth is in the middle because it is the basest part of the universe. Whereas fire, that is the planets and the stars, are the most pure elements. That's actually somewhere around there is where heaven is. And it made sense that heaven was looking down on that base part of nature. But on the other hand, That's why for Christians, God sent Christ to that middle of the universe. That if you think about it, once you start having a universe in which the earth is just one of the things spinning around the sun, why is there one Christ? Why are we special? And in fact, Giordano Bruno in 1600 says, maybe there are many Christs, maybe there are many revelations, many salvations, and they burned him at the stake. So this was the model that gives you the reason for astrology to be meaningful. Astrology is a very complicated topic where you need to understand how everything works in the universe. So it's not enough to know where the stars are. Like you probably all know this, but the zodiac is a collection of stars that the sun passes through in the year. And so the reason that there are the astrological signs is because that's the month or the 2 months, that's really month, when the sun is passing through that part of the zodiac. But that's a really small part of what astrology is, because you also need to know where all the planets are they aligning? You need, for your own personal health, if I was your physician, I would need to cast your horoscope knowing your exact moment of birth, and therefore where all the planets were at that exact moment. And that would tell me, first of all, what kind of things you were going to do in your life, what problems you might have, what risks you would run, but also what health concerns you might have. Now, you might say to yourself, wait a minute, doesn't that do away with free will? They had thought of that, so it gave a supposition of what could happen, but because of free will, you still could influence the stars. But that was a big bone of contention, so there was a lot of discussion about whether the stars told you what to do or only inclined you in that particular way. And astrology was, of course, used to predict the weather, which was important in an agricultural society, to cast horoscopes, as I've said, to predict your life history, or to give it decisions about, advice about when decisions should be made. Should I embark on a new venture now, or should I wait? John Dee, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, and she took his advice about what should be her coronation day, when she should launch attacks against the Spanish, all sorts of things. There were people in her privy council who were very concerned that this astrologer was telling her to do these things. But for her, just like Ronald Reagan, it was very important. Just so you don't think that this is just some crackpotty thing in the 16th century. There's a third part of the magic that is part of this instrumental technology that helps us to determine health in the Middle Ages, and that's the area of alchemy and the philosopher's stone. So basically what alchemy is it's matter theory in a sense. It's looking at what are the substances in nature? What is the underlying substance of nature? And how can we make nature change its outward form from one thing to another? So if you believe that gold, for example, what makes something gold? If what makes something gold is its color, then it would make a lot of sense that you could take a less expensive metal and change its color, and it would become gold. So you could take lead, add something red to it through something relatively complicated, sort of bake it for quite a long time, boil it, distill it off, and it could become gold. So that's only one of the things that alchemy did, but it was a very strong one, was using base metals to make gold and silver. So alchemy comes from an Aristotelian view that the earth is a kind of womb in which base metals grow. It's actually kind of interesting. It's okay to mine because you mine things and then it'll grow back again. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, when people mined, they would always give thanks to Mother Earth and, sort of apologize for taking it away. But they knew that when they came back, there would be more there. And the earth grows metals in a kind of ranked order. So it starts with lead, and eventually, as it matures, it becomes gold. And so maybe we can do that faster. Maybe we can do that by distilling things and putting them in interesting fires and banking them with lots of dung and that sort of thing. It also comes from Plato's view. Plato, of course, was Aristotle's pupil. And Plato believed that prime matter, just said his pupil, his teacher. Plato was viewed that the prime matter was undifferentiated, and that gradually it became different things. So that you start with undifferentiated matter, and gradually through time, it becomes individual things. So, why can't humans do all of this? What they believed is that they needed some kind of catalyst. So it couldn't just be done by putting it in a big vat and boiling it. You had to have some kind of catalyst to move it from one thing to another. And they called that catalyst a philosopher's stone. It was not necessarily a stone or even a substance. It could be a process. Usually, it often included mercury. That was a popular one. And when we think of that as kind of crazy, but it's important to remember that in the Middle Ages, people experienced transformation of one thing into another every Sunday. When they went to church, they saw the bread that the priest had change before them into the body of Christ. They knew that transubstantiation was possible. They knew, therefore, that other kinds of transformation could be possible, to the extent that we could have the knowledge that God has. And so, again, that comes back to how far away are we from the full knowledge of God's universe. So it's perhaps not a surprise that the spiritual and Christian elements were added to alchemy over the years, and alchemy became more and more of a spiritual journey rather than just an instrumental one. And the reason I show you this, the container on the right-hand side is called a pelican, and it's a very specific kind of jar that allows you to distill things. But it was named for the pelican that you see on the other side. And the pelican, again, many of you may know this, is a symbol for Christ. And the reason that the pelican is a symbol for Christ is because the pelican was believed, as you see in this picture, to gouge her own chest so that she could feed her children with her blood. Pretty interesting, eh? So the pelican jar was so named because of this spiritual relationship to Christianity. So this develops over many, many years, several centuries, for 1,000 years even. But then in the 16th century, we begin to see some changes, in part because a series of educated scholars began to be kind of interested in how these technologies worked. Where before the Black Death in the 14th century, magic had been largely instrumental, that is, how to accomplish something, in the 15th century, intellectuals began to be interested in spiritual journeys. The most important source of this change, I think, was the development of Neoplatonism, that in the 15th century in Florence, bankrolled by Cosimo de' Medici, a number of humanists, like Ficino is probably the most famous one, that Ficino began to translate Plato's works, that Aristotle's works had been known throughout, from antiquity all the way through the Middle Ages, but Plato's works were largely not known, in part because they had not been translated into Arabic by Islamic scholars, and so had to be reintroduced from Greek when Constantinople fell and Greek texts started to come back into Italy. How's that for a thumbnail sketch of 1,000 years of history? And so in the 15th century, they found these Greek sources. They had just begun to learn Greek again. It was almost a dead language in Europe. And they started to read Plato. And Plato made an argument about the spiritual nature of nature itself and of our relationship with it. The biggest thing that Plato said is that what's most important is not the everyday world, it's the ideal. It's the ideal in our head rather than the tangible world that we see. And so when you think of a table, what's most important about a table is not that it exists and that I can put things on it. It's that in my head I have an idea of a table, and that's what tells me this is a table. When we see dogs, the reason we know they're all dogs is because they all participate in dogness. And so we move from, in medical terms, from gathering individual case stories and building up a knowledge of how illnesses happen and what we're going to do with them, to thinking of a kind of larger spiritual, philosophical view of what is health, what does a healthy body look like, who are we as humans, what do we expect to get out of the life that we live, how do we lead a good life. And so part of health is leading a good life. So the Platonic Academy in Florence began to discover these mystical texts. And a number of these mystical texts, not just Plato, began to claim that we could manipulate the world through spiritual, esoteric knowledge, hidden knowledge that was hidden both from our views, but from the views of uneducated people. So you would have to get the Illuminati, the people who were part of some secret group together, and they would be able to manipulate nature. If any of you have read or seen the Da Vinci Code, this is what they're claiming, is that Da Vinci himself, that's what he's claiming, is that Da Vinci himself was part of one of these esoteric groups that were looking for a control over nature. And part of that control was potentially long life or immortality. But some of it was just a spiritual journey and the ability to live forever spiritually after death as well. There's a number of these groups, I'm not going to go through them all. They include Neoplatonism, which I've already talked about, Hermeticism from the so-called Hermes Trismegistus, whose name does lead to us talking about things being hermetically sealed. The Rosicrucians, who were maybe didn't exist but were famous, and the Kabbalists, which is all based on the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew texts, and counting of letters and numbers. It's number magic in that way. There's a lot of Hollywood stars that are now really, really keen on Kabbalah, and that was really discovered in the 15th century. I'll just leave that there. All of these were very attractive to the powerful leaders in Europe, and therefore they were politically important. And that gets me back to what I started with, that when you think of these kind of philosophies, you have to see them as living in some kind of political moment. That rulers in Europe in this period wanted to win, to be better than other rulers. And some of that was through warfare, but warfare was so expensive that the King of Spain had to declare bankruptcy 5 times in the 16th century because the cost of going to battle was just so excruciatingly high. After the Armada tried to invade England, Elizabeth could not pay the sailors on her vessels, and they sat on the vessels for several months until they were all starving because she couldn't afford to pay them. So what's a cheaper way of developing, your status? Well, get some great philosophers, some great magicians into your court, pay them a small stipend, and get them to do extraordinary things. So people like Galileo, who came to the court of Cosimo de' Medici, part of what he was expected to do was publish books saying that he'd seen a new star, fight, metaphorically speaking, with Johann Kepler, who was the imperial astronomer and astrologer for the court of the Habsburg emperor. And so all of these leaders were looking for a certain type of power that came from a knowledge of this esoterica, which had nothing to do with the knowledge of nature itself. It had to do with, I have my philosopher, he's better than your philosopher. And a good example of this actually is John Dee, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. John Dee was the astronomer and astrologer in the court of Elizabeth I. He was a university-trained scholar, and he was actually an expert on all sorts of things. He was a mathematician first. He was responsible for the first English translation of Euclid, which was very important to the development of mathematics in England. He was also the person who advised most of the major explorers on their voyages to the Northeast and Northwest Passage. So Frobisher was his friend, Davis of Davis Strait was his friend, Hudson knew him. All of those people went to see John Dee before they went on their voyages. But he was also, but he was also a magician. He was also someone who believed absolutely that there were hidden forces in the world and that we would be able to have power over our own bodies, over our own spirituality, if we could just find that power. And one of the things he did was what's called scrying, which is crystal ball gazing. And there is his scrying ball. So it's a sort of size of a pumpkin kind of ball. And here's how it works. You look into it, and a spirit appears in the crystal ball, and it tells you things. Now, unfortunately, John Dee could never see anything in this crystal ball. But luckily for him, this young man, Edward Kelly, could see things in it. And so he was happy to pay Edward Kelly's way. He lived in his household so that Kelly could tell him what the spirit said in the scrying ball. Now, we might believe he was a charlatan and that he was taking advantage of John Dee's gullibility. But they had a strong connection for many years. And what happened is that Kelly would see an angel or some kind of being in the crystal ball who would have a chart of symbols, and he would point at the symbols one at a time, and Kelly would write them down. And then Dee kind of translated those into the message that was coming from the spirit world. Eventually, the spirit world told them that they should swap wives. Turns out Jane Dee was not so keen, and so she kicked Kelly out, but eventually they were reconciled again. So you can see that this, even at the time, this was seen as dangerous because it was supernatural magic, and a little suspect. That Dee, sadly for posterity, he had the best library in England, and eventually his house was ransacked because he was believed to be a black magician, and he had to flee to the continent. And he did eventually come back and died in his own bed, amazingly so. So these are the kinds of technologies that help people to find their way into the spirit world. But we do start to see a change that's taking place in the 16th century. That I had been saying that early magic was instrumental, was really looking at how you solved problems.